friends, it's Steph from cheapskatecook.com. Today I'm so excited that you're here because we're going to talk about sourdough and how to make the easiest sourdough bread ever. And I actually, a couple of weeks ago, I shared exactly how we make this in our own house. It's very flexible, it's very easy, and when I say it is just mix, pour, and bake, that's just about it. That's all the work that it takes for you. It does take a little bit of planning ahead of time, so I'm going to walk you through the steps, but with just learning anything sourdough, then it takes a little bit of thinking ahead and just a change in the way that we know how to cook and the way that we've learned how to cook in the past. And so I'm just going to show you exactly what we do in our house. And the first thing that I'm going to tell you is this is the sourdough starter that I did last night. So it's about 10 a.m. my time, and I did this about probably 8:30 last night. So it's been sitting for like 14-ish hours. And when I mixed it together, the flour, the water, and 1 tablespoon of starter, so I think it was 90 grams, maybe 100 grams of flour, 100 grams of water, and a tablespoon of starter. And in the recipe, then I show cups and tablespoons and all that. I've just found that it's easier for me to maintain my starter if I'm measuring in grams. Anyway, so you can see it's poofed up a lot. It was like this much when I stirred it together last night, and then it's nice and poofy. So that's the sign of a healthy starter. If your starter doesn't poof up that much, that's okay. You can still make sourdough bread and it'll probably be just fine and it'll still be delicious. We make this bread all the time, but because I change the different flours, or I change the time, and I keep it flexible with our family, this bread doesn't turn out the same way every single time, because my goal isn't to make like perfect restaurant quality food for my family. My goal is to save money, eat healthy, and find a way to do that makes sense in our modern life. So we've got a lot going on. I'm not trying to make perfect bread every time along with everything else. I'm just trying to make bread that our family enjoys. And that's why I love this recipe, because even though it turns out a little bit different depending on how long I let it rise or what flours I use, things like that, it still turns out delicious, and my family never complains about it, and it's amazing. And we use it for pizza, and we use it for sandwiches, and we use it for soup, and we just eat it straight out of the pan because it's that good. So that is my goal with this bread, and that is my hope for you if that's the kind of recipe that you are looking for. All right, so we've got our sourdough starter, and I'm going to talk a minute about the flour, because I know a lot of you guys use lots of different kinds of flour, and you've asked if this recipe can use different kinds of flour depending on what you can find at the stores right now, depending on what your family prefers to use. So this is unbleached flour. This is the flour that I use to feed my starter, because I found the starter just stays healthier and happier when I use unbleached flour. So I used to be die-hard whole grain flour all the time, but sourdough starter, oddly enough, converted me to being okay with some unbleached flour. So we've got this guy, and then some of you guys are going to enjoy this, and some of you guys are going to be like, okay, we're already talking about sourdough, why are we bringing this up? And that is whole grains. Okay, so these are some spelt berries, and these are whole wheat berries, because we grind our own grain. And for some of you guys, that's not where you are, and that's not what you plan on doing, and that's totally fine. You don't have to do that. But a lot of you guys have asked me to talk more about this, so this is your chance. If you are not into grinding your own grains, which is totally reasonable, grinding your grains is a little out there, just ignore this part and just use your whole wheat flour, or use whatever you have. And if you are grinding your own grains, then this is for you. I'm going to grind them, or if you're interested in it, then you can kind of see our setup. So this is my Wonder Mill, which I've had for 10 years now, I think, 11 years, a long time. I love it. I got it as soon as I could, as soon as we could afford it, because I knew that how much better freshly ground grains tasted and how much better they were for our bodies, more or less, depending on the research that you believe. I just love it, honestly. It's what I grew up with. I think it's delicious. I think it smells amazing. I love working with baked goods that have freshly ground grain. And yes, this guy's a little bit of an investment, but overall, it helps us save a lot of money on really high quality grains. So these are like non-GMO and they're fresh and they're whole and all these things. I've got spelt right here. I've got, I think it's soft white wheat right here. So you can get really nerdy and it's not gonna cost that much money. Compared to buying like pre-ground flours at the grocery store and paying like $13 for a 10-pound bag or a 5-pound bag or something like that. So this is way more affordable long term. So I've never done this backwards before. Let's see how this works out. But basically you turn this on, you pour the grain in here, and then the flour comes in here. And I'm just gonna show you how I do that, and then you can just see that for what it's worth. And we're gonna use that flour for the sourdough today. So turn it on. So that's how we grind it. I don't have anything to relate it to because it's kind of weird, but basically you just turn it on, pour the grain in, and let it grind and then filter into this flour canister. There are lots of different kinds of grain mills on the market. This is the model that I grew up with, and it's the only one I've had in my adult life, so I can't like recommend from personal experience other grain mills. But I do know the mock mill is highly recommended, the Nutrimill is highly recommended. If this one broke today and I had to replace it, I would probably look at a mock mill. So that's just my personal preference. So here's the flour. And you can see it just looks like regular flour. So for those of you who just use grocery store flour, like that's all it is here. And because it was just ground, it's kind of like sifted flour right now. So when I say like 6 cups of freshly ground wheat, that's actually more like 4.5 cups or something of like whole wheat flour from the grocery store that's had time to settle. So that's why I like using a food scale. But if you don't have a food scale, and whether you use freshly ground or whether you use like whole grain flour from the grocery store, you can still make this bread recipe because I've made it with all of the flours, using this and just using cups, and it still turns out well. You can monkey with it, you can get really particular with it and find like what's gonna give you the exact results that you want every time. But I just wanted to give you a bread recipe that works no matter what you have and is still gonna turn out, because a lot of us aren't gonna be super picky about it. A lot of us are just like, I just need bread and I don't care that much about it being perfect. So for this bread recipe, we're going to get a big glass bowl out. The measurements that I use for this, again, I use a food scale because I found that's the easiest way to get consistent results with my bread. Otherwise, you have to like use the cups and just kind of check the texture and see if it's right or not, and then add more flour or add more water depending on the texture. And I'm just like, you know, it's so much easier to just dump the flour in, you know, however many grams, dump the water in, and know that that is what I need. So I use a food scale, but in the recipe, I converted it to cups and to tablespoons and all of that for you guys so that you don't have to do that in your head or look it up or feel like you have to buy a food scale. So we're gonna start with 1,000 grams of flour. And this is a mixture of spelt and white whole wheat, but you can use whatever flours you have on hand. You can use some bread flour, you can use white flour, whatever. And I do like most of it whole wheat, and then some of it white. It's just my preference. Like I said, I used to be like 100% whole grain all the time. But then just somewhere along the way, I was like, you know, a little bit of white flour tastes good. And we're already making sourdough, so I'm just gonna use some white flour. So that's 1,000 grams. And then we add the water. So the cool thing about using a food scale is that I don't have to measure out a whole bunch of things. I just have the one bowl and I dump the flour in, and now I'm at 1,000 grams, and I'm going to add 800 grams of water. That's 800 grams. And next we're going to do 150 grams of starter. So this is starter that was fed like 8 hours ago, and now it's been sitting and it's poofed up. It started out like right here and now it's all the way up here. It's okay if your starter doesn't poof up that much, especially if it's like made with all whole wheat or something. It's not going to poof up as much as the as like a white flour based starter. Woo! I almost forgot to share the thing. So you want 150 grams, and I converted it to cups for you in the recipe, so you can just use cups if that's easier for you. And the reason why, so the goal here is to have enough starter left in this jar that I can feed it after this and use it for like another bread recipe. So I'm not using all the starter in this jar. There's still a little bit left. Now I'm just monkeying with it to make sure I get the right weight. All right, so that's exactly 150. So you can see here, there's stuff on the sides, there's a little bit on the bottom. So I will feed this after I stir the bread. And that way we can just keep the whole sourdough thing going. So there's that. And then the other thing we need is salt. So I've got a little cup here, and we're gonna do 20 grams of salt. There we go. My salt is a little saltier than others, so I don't do quite 20 grams. All right, now we're gonna stir. This is the part that I really wanted to demonstrate, because you can read everything on the recipe and you don't really need to see somebody else do it. But the stirring part is the thing that I found makes a big difference. So I'm not just gonna sit here and just go, you know, like stir it like you would cookie dough or something like that, where it didn't matter as much. Instead, I'm taking the spatula and I'm scraping it along the sides of the bowl and kind of folding the dough over. So you can just stir it and it will turn out, it will make bread still, so don't feel too intimidated about getting the stirring thing right. I've just found that when I'm a little gentler with the dough and a little more careful, I can have much better results in the bread without needing to do like a whole nother step. So you're not actually like kneading the dough, but it does create kind of a kneading-ish action for the dough. So I think that's why it helps it turn out better. You can see I'm turning the bowl and I'm just scraping along the sides. I found it works better if I like mix some of the flour and the water together and then add the starter, and then I almost just dumped that in there. And then add the salt on the top. All right, so you can see there, everything's all mixed. It's beautiful, it's a very wet dough. It's not something that you want to hold with your hands. That's good, and I kind of like take the top and kind of smear it a little bit so that it's like one solid ball. No big deal. And then I'm gonna cover it like this. and I'm gonna let it rise. And I let this rise, I prefer to let it rise in my oven with the light bulb on, but the oven turned off. So that creates a really warm environment. I forget what temperature it is in there, like 90 degrees or something like that. So it's really warm, and it makes it much easier for the natural yeast in the sourdough to be really happy and to poof up. My super official word, poof up. And so I let it sit in there for like 5 hours. If I'm mixing this up at night and I'm gonna make bread in the morning, so it's gonna be sitting out more like 8 or 10 or maybe even 12 hours, I won't put it in the oven. I'll just set it on my counter because, you know, it'll be a cooler temperature and it'll take longer for the yeast to raise the whole loaf of bread. But because I'm gonna try to finish this and have it for dinner tonight, I'm going to let it sit in my oven. It'll be nice and warm, and I'm gonna let it sit in there for like 4 or 5 hours, and then we'll do the second rise. So I want to show you guys like every step of the way and not just kind of leave you with this initial step. So I'm actually going to come back here on live video 4 or 5 hours from now, whenever the bread is ready. I can't wait to talk to you guys again later and show you, but sometimes it's just easier to see somebody do it, right? So I'm going to show you how I do it in a couple of hours. Hey, welcome back. We're gonna finish the sourdough bread that we started this morning. We have the bread dough stuff. If you remember from this morning, the bread came to about here, so it's almost doubled in the last 5 hours, which is a lot. I know it's a long time. Typically when we think of like bread that uses instant yeast, that takes a long time. Instant yeast uses a short amount of time. Sourdough bread seems like it takes forever, and that's true because it's not instant. It is a natural bread and just takes a lot longer, but that means it's more delicious. Sometimes it's better for our stomachs, and anyway, it's really good and it's super low maintenance. You're gonna want some oil. So I have avocado oil right here. You can use olive oil. I'm trying to save my olive oil for salad dressing, so we're using avocado oil. This is just a sourdough flatbread, and you can choose whether to just slice it and eat it or to like cut it crossways and make flatbread sandwiches, that kind of thing. That's why it's so flexible, because you don't need to worry about whether or not the bread rises like in a traditional loaf pan or something. You know, whenever we make sourdough in the loaf pan, the question is always like, is it gonna like poof up? Is it gonna rise enough? Like, that's what makes it so complicated, is trying to make the right dough that's going to rise well enough. So I'm like, let's just skip all of that, just pour it into a baking sheet and call it good, right? All right, baking sheet and dough. So I want you to get a really good look at this dough. So you can see there are lots of little holes in it. It's kind of jello-y. So you can see how it kind of feels. Very sticky, it's a very wet dough. Much, much wetter than your traditional yeast bread. But all the little holes in it and stuff, that's gonna make a really delicious bread in the end. So, we take the cookie sheet and I'm gonna put some oil in there, and you do want to use plenty of oil. You can use less oil or like no oil at all if you use parchment paper, but then you end up using parchment paper, and so that's like one more disposable thing that's gonna cost money, and so you decide whether or not you want to use parchment paper or plenty of oil to get it to not stick, because again, it's a very wet dough. And then I do this, make sure my hands are nice and oiled so that they're not going to stick to the dough. And again, I don't want to just like rip the dough up. Let's see if you can see that better. Okay. I don't want to just rip the dough apart. I want to be very, very gentle with it. And then this is a bench scraper. It's like just a little plasticky, cheap one, but you can use a rubber spatula like you would use to turn pancakes. You can use a knife, you can use your bare hands, a butter knife, it doesn't matter. So, scraping it with my hands so we don't rip it too hard. And this is gonna make 2 loaves, so at one point I'm gonna have to cut it. And I just cut it kind of along the bowl like that. And that's just very approximate. I'm also gonna say, like, you can smell the sour. I know you can't smell it through the video, but when you do it, I've had some people ask me like whether it's supposed to taste or smell super sour, and the answer is yes, it should smell very, very fermenty. So what you're doing here is you're just, you know, oiling your hands and you're just kind of squishing it along. Squishing's the best word that I can think of. I heard someone relate it to like massaging someone's back. That seems gross, especially since I've got my hands in this doughy thing. I'm trying not to think about that. I'm just squishing the dough, and it's gonna get really thin, but it's also going to poof up quite a bit in the second rise. And you might be able to tell I kind of over oiled. There's like a lot of standing oil in here. I was a little too enthusiastic. But that's not a bad thing. It's just going to make the dough like really easy, the bread really easy to get out of the pan, and it's gonna make the edges nice and crispy and oily like after it bakes, so I'm not complaining. All right, so then lots of little fingerprints in it, trying to make the dough as even as possible. There's some parts that are, okay, that's good enough. So you can monkey with it as much as you want. And then this guy is going to sit in the oven for 30 minutes. I'm not going to cover it or anything because it's not going to rise for super duper long. And it's just gonna sit in there for 30 minutes. If I was proofing it out of the oven, then the top would get really dry, so I might consider putting plastic wrap or something over it, but I try to avoid using plastic wrap where I can. So sits in the oven for 30 minutes, and then I'm gonna take it out and preheat the oven to 450 degrees. And then I'm gonna let the oven preheat like completely, so about 20 to 30 minutes. And after that 20 to 30 minutes is over, then I'll check the bread and decide whether I want to put it in the oven yet. If it's not super poofy yet, then I might let it sit for another 10 minutes or so. Most of the time, I just throw it in and it's fine. The main thing is to make sure that you preheat the oven really well, because preheating the oven creates this like, you know, really hot atmosphere that you put the bread into, and hitting like room temperature bread going into that hot environment makes the bread just poofs up nicely. So that's gonna be a lot better for you than not preheating the oven and letting this rise longer or whatever. And then we also use this for pizza dough. If we're using it for pizza dough, then I will let it rise for a lot shorter time because I don't want it to be very thick. I want it to be thinner. And then, like I said, the recipe that I showed you makes 2. So I've got another baking sheet here, and I can make another one. That is it. If you have any more questions, drop them in the comments. I'll be hanging out there this evening and I will try to answer them as soon as I can. Go ahead and hit like on this video so that other people can see it. And I'm so glad that you joined me today. I hope that this answers some questions, maybe helped demystify the process a little bit. Thanks for hanging out with me, and I hope you have a great day. Bye.